American pressure on Israel, not Israel, while visiting Israel, and unacceptable to Israel, to the land of Israel. Welcome to Eyes on Israel. I'm Rabbi Pesach Willicke. Over the last few days, we've noticed that a number of countries have decided to recognize a Palestinian state. Specifically, we see that Spain, Norway, and Ireland have done so. According to the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, the decision to recognize a Palestinian state has a single goal. As he writes, it is to help Israelis and Palestinians achieve peace. That's kind of interesting, considering that whether or not there's a Palestinian state and at what point there should be one, if ever, is agreed upon between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority to be something that's to be left for negotiations. How unilaterally declaring a Palestinian state or recognizing one helps achieve peace while Israel's in an existential war is beyond me. According to the Irish statement out of the Irish government, the government recognizes Palestine as a sovereign and independent state and agreed to establish full diplomatic relations between Dublin and Ramallah. Well, at least he didn't say Jerusalem. Let's recall that Gaza has been governed for the last close to 20 years by Hamas, and Hamas is in the process of being destroyed, and there is no governing body in Gaza. And Fatah, the faction that is otherwise known as the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, that governs the Palestinian areas of autonomy in Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, has been in power on a 4-year term, meaning Abbas was elected to a 4-year term in 2006. There hasn't been an election since because everyone knows that he's polling less than 20% and would lose to Hamas in a landslide. So the question of who would govern what, I don't think has been all that well thought out. No one has given more thought to this than the great Ambassador David Friedman, who joins us on Eyes on Israel. Ambassador Friedman, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Pesach. It's
so, Ambassador Friedman, you were part of the Trump administration of some of the most revolutionary and important foreign policy decisions that were made about the Middle East in history, and specifically the decisions that looked like they were just merely pro-Israel decisions like moving the embassy and the Abraham Accords, ended up really bringing unprecedented peace and prosperity to the region. So when you see announcements like this by these nations that they're recognizing a Palestinian state, how do you see this? Explain to us everything that's wrong with this, please.
Look, we can't obsess about what these countries do because we'll make ourselves crazy. I mean, as you pointed out, there's 140 of them out there. And in the case of, in the case of Norway, Spain, and Ireland, I mean, these are countries with large Muslim populations. How they got that way is for another discussion. But, we're at risk in America of getting to that point as well, as we're seeing. But these are internal issues among these countries. They have no effect on the facts on the ground in Israel. It's a shame. It's a shame that all these countries are elevating a kind of cheap political short-term considerations for matters of principle. But that's what they're doing. I mean, my view has always been, Israel's got to be a great Israel and America's got to be a great America. And if we get those two things right, I'm not going to lose any sleep over Norway, Spain, and Ireland.
So, Ambassador Friedman, a lot of people listening to this, even if they're, on Team Israel and they see Hamas as the evil genocidal terrorist group that it is and pray for Israel to destroy them. At the same time, a lot of people, even on our side of the football, as it were, say, hey, a two-state solution sounds like a solution. You got two peoples, you got two states, let's divide everything up. Two people living side by side. Isn't that what the Palestinians want? You've done a lot of thinking on this. Why is that notion, in your view, incorrect? Why is it misguided?
Well, in the first place, Pesach, what it does is it just perpetuates that famous definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We've seen this movie. We actually did a dry run. Israel did a dry run for a Palestinian state when it left Gaza, right? I mean, they left behind Gaza. Not a single Jew lived there from 2005 on. Not a single army soldier was there. The Palestinians in Gaza were given, this beautiful, beachfront property with a western-facing view on the Mediterranean, a lot of agriculture. Israel had really done incredible things there agriculturally. The Palestinians got tons of money. They got it from the EU, from America, from the United Nations. UNRWA came in, was given tons of money. They were given every opportunity to flourish in a peaceful manner in Gaza, again, as sort of a dry run for what could be. And they failed the test. I mean, miserably. They took all this money and they built the largest terror tunnel network in the world, 350 miles. They bought weaponry. They began shooting rockets at innocent civilians in Israel. They elected Hamas. Remember, Hamas didn't take over in a violent revolution. They were chosen by the people of Gaza to rule. And as you point out, if there was an election today in Judea and Samaria, they'd probably win there as well. 82% of those in Judea and Samaria think October 7th was a great moment for the Palestinian people. So we just can't do this again. I mean, what we would be doing in a Palestinian state is creating a platform for the Palestinians to complete the destruction of the state of Israel. It will be a suicidal, as they say, a final solution, not a two-state solution, but a final solution for the Jewish people.
So, Ambassador Friedman, you were, of course, the moving force behind the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. We were told for decades by everyone on both sides of the aisle that if we were ever to move the embassy, oh my gosh, if the U.S. would ever recognize Jerusalem as the capital and move the embassy there would be outrage in the Muslim world, the Arab world would be aflame, and there would be riots in the streets, it would be a geopolitical nightmare. And you went ahead and moved the embassy anyway. And a lot of people think the embassy move is symbolic. And I say, no, it's not symbolic. It showed that the king has no clothes and that, in fact, there can be peace without solving the Palestinian state issue, even though we were told that that could never happen, which, of course, then lays the predicate for the Abraham Accords. Is there a way forward? Because, again, when people look at me as someone who on this show, every week on this show, I speak about how the whole concept of a Palestinian state, of a two-state solution, is no solution at all. But people always wonder, what is the way forward? Does the embassy move and the Abraham Accords and the lessons learned there, do they lay a predicate for some other solution? And I know that you've been working on something.
Well, they do, and I think the most important data point now is October 7th, because I think we've learned a lot. We have a lot of clarity coming out of October 7th, a lot of trauma, but a lot of clarity as well. What we understand is, first of all, what won't work. So I don't think I need to spend a lot of time convincing you that a two-state solution won't work. I mean, that's if I have to convince you of that, then I've got an uphill climb on this conversation. But then the question is, okay, we can say no to a two-state solution all we want. What would work, right? And what I'm looking at, and I'll have a book coming out in September on this called One Jewish State. And my point is this: right now, I think for the first time, maybe in thousands of years, you have the convergence of politics, economics, and history and faith, right? Because over the last 50 years or so, the politicians have always said, well, we got to separate the Jews and the Palestinians, the Israelis and the Palestinians, create two states, and we know that doesn't work. And the people of faith would say, don't do that, because the land you're going to give to the Palestinians includes some of the holiest sites for both the Jewish and the Christian faiths, from the tomb of Joseph to Shiloh, where the tabernacle rested, to Bethel, where Jacob had his dream, to the old city of Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born and David was born, to the tomb of Rachel, to Hebron. This is ground zero for biblical Israel, right? And people of faith said, don't give it away. And the politicians would say, yeah, we get it, but we really need to in order to achieve a greater good. Okay, now everybody should be on the same page. Meaning the people of faith have been vindicated. Their faith has been vindicated politically and economically, right? We now see that they're right, and that there can't be a Palestinian state in the only way. And this is where I think I might be moving the needle beyond where the existing thinking is. The only way, I believe, for peace in the region is for Israel to have complete sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, not just Area C, which is the so-called Jewish version of Judea and Samaria, but all of it, A, B, C, the entirety of Judea and Samaria, for converging reasons. Okay, on the faith side, it's obvious. Israel will protect the holiest sites in the world for the benefit of Jews and Christians. Okay, that's easy. But what about the tougher issues that the politicians have always argued? Well, the reality is, if you look at Israel, right, it's got about a $55,000 GDP per capita, right? That's 20 times that of the Arab communities in Judea and Samaria. It's 15 times that of Jordan. It's 20, 30 times that of Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and Egypt. So if you're an Arab living in Judea and Samaria, right, and you're looking around and you say, with whom do I want to be able to align to raise myself up out of this misery that seems to be inflicting the entirety of the Arab world? Also, none of them are democracies. None of them have transparent economies. Who do I want to align with? How do I want to improve? And the only answer, the only template that makes any sense are the Arab citizens of the state of Israel, right? There's 2 million of them. Okay, they have a 3 or 4% unemployment rate. They have the highest penetration into elite universities of any Arab community in the world, highest standard of living of any Arab community in the world. The Christian Arabs in Israel, more of them attend universities than Jews. All right. I mean, if you go to the emergency room of Hadassah Hospital or a hospital, the odds are you're going to be treated by a Palestinian doctor. So we know Israel knows what works, and it has to export that into the Palestinian territories, or I would say Judea and Samaria, and that's, I think, the solution.
We only have a couple seconds left. Tell everyone again the name of the upcoming book and when it's going to be available.
It's called One Jewish State. Simple point. There's 40 Muslim countries in the world, 30 Hindu, Christian, Buddhist countries, just one Jewish state, the size of New Jersey. It's not too much to ask for. The world should have a place for one Jewish state. You can look at the website for this. It's onejewishstate.co, not .com, .co, onejewishstate.co. And the book will be out in September, which I think gives more intellectual heft to this, I think, important process.
We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel after this word from our sponsor. Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. As always, Eyes on Israel is powered by Israel 365. Make sure to go to Israel365news.com for all your news and updated analysis from Israel, and go to Israel365.com to check out everything that we have to offer there, including my author page where you can find all of my writings. Israel 365 has a range of programs and a range of products, and it's a great way to support this show by getting involved and a great way to stay informed about what's really going on in Israel. This past Monday, May 27th, it was reported that dozens of Gazans were killed and hundreds injured in an Israeli airstrike in Rafah. If true, this incident would confirm the worst fears and warnings we've been hearing for months, namely, that an Israeli invasion of Rafah would mean terrible loss of civilian life. Everyone from President Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken to the UN and the Egyptian government have been freaking out, basically, pressuring Israel not to go into Rafah because of the high concentration of civilians there, most of whom had moved there from the northern part of the Gaza Strip in the early weeks of the war. The mainstream media was quick to jump on the story as evidence of Israel's wanton use of inappropriate force. This, of course, turned out to be false, as we'll soon see. Accepting the initial reports of Israeli culpability for deaths of Gazans that are not their responsibility is sadly nothing new. In the early days of the war, you may remember there were reports of an Israeli airstrike on a hospital that killed 500 Gazan civilians. That story turned out to be false. No rocket hit a hospital. It hit a parking lot next to the hospital. It wasn't fired by Israel, but by Islamic Jihad, a terrorist group allied with Hamas. And 500 people weren't killed. The death toll was less than 50. But if you still Google the words Gaza hospital attack, the original false coverage has not been taken down by the mainstream media. And now we have a new blood libel against Israel. This time, Israel's accused of killing dozens and injuring hundreds in a wanton attack on a displaced persons camp. Mainstream media coverage even mistranslated Prime Minister Netanyahu's words to imply that Israel took responsibility for the deaths. Here's the CNN headline quoting Netanyahu, referring to the incident as, quote, a tragic mistake, when in fact he called it in Hebrew a takala tragit. The word takala does not mean mistake, it means mishap. This is important because he wasn't admitting error, as he would be if he called it a mistake. He was simply saying that this incident was tragic and unintended. It should also be noted, as we have said many times before on this show, that Israel has done more than any army in history to protect enemy civilians from harm. This has been noted repeatedly by none other than Major John Spencer, Chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, the leading expert on the subject. So what actually happened in Rafah on Monday? For that, we turn to our good friend, IDF Reserve Major Elliot Chodoff, to break it all down. Elliot, welcome back once again to Eyes on Israel. Good to have you back.
Thanks, Pesach. Good to be back.
All right, so Elliot,
Yeah.
What happened here in Rafah the other day? Could you set the record straight, give us the actual details so that our viewers, our audience, will know the truth?
Sure. First of all, it's a tragedy. Anytime innocents, non-involved, non-combatants get killed is a tragedy. The question is, who's behind the tragedy? Is it a pure, as originally said by Prime Minister Netanyahu, a takala, a mishap, a breakdown of something, or is there something a little more involved in it? So let's start with the fact that this particular event, even more so than the hospital, provided the media with a perfect storm of propaganda. You have the fact that it happened in the environment of Rafah, which means that it can be connected incorrectly to the Israeli ground operation there. One thing have nothing to do with the other. It involved displaced people in a humanitarian zone that was supposed to be a safe zone. Here again, a story in and of itself. American weapons. How many more pieces do you need to put in to create, again, this perfect storm of propaganda? Except, A, the event itself was the targeting of two senior Hamas leaders who are actually responsible for the terrorism out of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. In other words, why these characters were in Gaza is its own question, but the connection between West Bank and Gaza is tremendous. This morning, once again, there was shooting from the West Bank into Israeli villages on this side, as they would say, of the Green Line, not in the so-called territories. So Hamas is Hamas. That's number one. Israel targeted these two guys because they are leading Hamas terrorists. They happen to be in one of the neighborhoods on the outskirts of Rafah. They could have been in Khan Yunis. They could have been in Gaza. They could have been in the West Bank. They could have been anywhere. They happened to be there. In other words, the coincidence of the ground operation and this operation was pure, just happened to be that way. That's number one. Number two, they were targeted with extremely precise small warhead weapons. In other words, the idea, as we generally do, and in this case we were able to do, at least on the surface, was target these two people. They were apparently in a corrugated steel hut. We knew where they were. The missile or missiles hit and took them out.
Hold on. So
Yes.
before you go on, because I saw reports, and I'm sure many other people did, that some massive bombs were used, the kind of bombs the U.S. didn't want Israel to use.
Exactly incorrect. Precision-guided small warhead weapons being precisely used for precisely this type of an operation. This is the mission for these weapons. That's what they were used for. And then some 100+ yards away, a fire breaks out among the tents. Incidentally, these two terrorists were not in the humanitarian area. They were outside of it by about 100 yards. In other words, there was absolutely no reason for Israel to assume that there would be any sort of additional damage. I hate the term collateral. Any sort of additional damage beyond the targeting. You know what? A bystander walking by, perhaps, but nothing of any significance or any scale from a military perspective. And then this fire erupts. And according to their reports, and on the one hand, I don't trust them. On the other hand, I have no reason, in this case, not to believe them after the fact. Some 45 people are killed, hundreds are injured, which wouldn't be surprising in a fire that breaks out in a tent city of evacuees. In other words, here, unlike the hospital, I will accept their numbers for lack of a better one, even though I don't trust them. And now the story. Go ahead. I mean, a fire did break out. We know a fire broke out among the tents. That's for real. Okay. So now the question is, where does the fire come from? And the first thing, of course, the blame is Israel dropped these massive bombs into this humanitarian area. Pesach, trust me, if Israel dropped a couple of 2,000-pound bombs into a tent area, the death toll would have zeros after it, not numbered in the 40s. We'd be talking about hundreds, if not even more than that. So that was clearly false to begin with. But still, the fire broke out. The initial estimate by the IDF, and by the way, it was investigated immediately, and here I have to say, the IDF investigates every operation, success and failure. In other words, the idea that this needs to be checked, any decent army does a post-op check. What worked, what didn't work, what worked as planned, what didn't work as planned. And here this was certainly not planned. So the first question is, how did it happen? The first speculation early on the next morning was that perhaps a piece of shrapnel had flown the 100 yards, which is not impossible, not likely, but not impossible, hit a propane tank, caused it to explode. This was the best explanation we could come up with on short notice. On deeper study, we find that in the immediate aftermath of our attack, there were secondary explosions. Now, for those who are not familiar, explosives can cause other explosives to explode. And it turns out there was ammunition there. There were bombs and missiles there. There was a rocket launching site adjacent to the humanitarian area. Let's be clear, a Hamas rocket launching site next to the humanitarian area. And these things simply blew up as a result of the Israeli attack and caused the damage that they caused.
So, Elliot, we only have about a minute and a half left, but let me just summarize what we have here. We have the same old story where Hamas uses a densely populated civilian area as a place, first of all, for actual combatants to hide out.
Correct.
Secondly, to store weapons and to use it as a launching pad for attacks on Israeli civilian areas. And therefore, the whole thing is a legitimate military target, even if Israel had targeted it.
Yes, but let me make one correction here. They didn't store weapons, they stored munitions. Had they stored rifles, nothing would have happened. They stored explosives.
Right.
Big difference.
In other words, it was basically booby-trapped that if Israel were to do this small scale operation just to take out a couple of people, it was primed for this explosion to happen. And once again, the civilian casualties, as tragic as they are, the responsibility for them, both legally and morally, rests solely on the shoulders of Hamas.
Yes.
Elliot, we don't have a lot more time. I just want to tell all of our listeners, we're going to have longer form conversations as we do frequently with Elliot on my podcast, the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast, available on all podcast platforms. Go look for it there. Elliot, thank you once again. Thank you so much for joining Eyes on Israel. We'll have you back soon.
Always a pleasure.
We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a few moments. Welcome back. 2 weeks ago, on Monday, May 20th, President Donald Trump posted a video to his Truth Social account. The video was a campaign ad that used a pre-made B-roll background of vintage newspaper available online. Barely legible in this background montage were the words Unified Reich. The word Reich, of course, brings to mind the Third Reich, the name for Hitler's regime in Nazi Germany. When the gaffe was discovered, the Trump campaign immediately took the video down. But President Joe Biden, along with the mainstream media, jumped on the latest opportunity to draw comparisons between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. Biden made a reaction video saying this explicitly. Comparisons between Trump and Hitler are nothing new, sadly. The left has been doing this since Trump first began running for president 8 years ago. Everyone from Hillary Clinton to Joanne Reed to comedian Bill Maher have explicitly compared Trump to Hitler for years.
So I had one of Hitler's speeches translated into English, and I think this tells us a lot about where Donald Trump is getting his ideas.
Now, of course, this comparison is ridiculous. Donald Trump has garnered more support from minority communities of color than any Republican in more than half a century, and his policies on Israel were the best for the Jewish state in history. But this comparison of Trump to Adolf Hitler is dangerous. Demonizing Trump in this way may be meant as a ploy to scare away minority voters, including Jews, but it also lays the groundwork for some crazy person on the left who buys this nonsense and might do something worse. Let's pray to God that President Trump is protected. Joining me now is Professor Dan McMillan, Holocaust historian and founder of Save Democracy in America. He holds a history PhD from Columbia as well as a law degree and has worked as a history professor and a prosecutor. He's the author of How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust from Basic Books. Professor McMillan, welcome to Eyes on Israel.
Thank you for having me, Rabbi.
So in my opening, I mentioned that as much as this seems almost like comic relief and a panic attack by the left, we really see that they've been using this rhetoric for a long time. And I believe, as I said, that it's very dangerous. What can you tell us about this comparison to Hitler that they're using, and what do you think this really means in the historical context?
Well, I mean, there's two things. There's sort of the fact today that both parties engage in messaging that's overwhelmingly negative, and instead of talking about how they're going to make our lives better, Republicans say that Biden wants to impose a Marxist dictatorship. Democrats compare President Trump to Hitler and say he's going to become a dictator. As far as the comparison, and then people try to draw comparisons between Germany in 1933 when Hitler took power and America today in 2024. As near as I can tell, none of these people are historians who know the first thing about Germany in 1933. I would just point out just a few of the dramatic differences, namely that in Germany in 1933, most Germans, very few Germans at that point, thought that the democratic form of government worked or was a good idea. Germany had only established a democracy 14 years earlier, after a long period under an authoritarian constitutional monarchy. Their first experience with democracy was very bad because of the economic and political upheaval during the Weimar years in the 1920s. By the time Hitler took power, the democracy was already dead. It was already a dictatorship governed by presidential decree. And the Nazi movement was an extraordinarily violent movement with 800,000 members of a paramilitary formation, the so-called stormtroopers. So this is very different from our country. I think the most important thing I want to say about America today is the democratic form of government is central to who we are. You know, we're the only country on earth where membership in the nation does not depend on race, religion, or any other external characteristic. It's about individual freedom, equality of opportunity, government by the people, which we invented in its modern form. I do think that American democracy has been very badly degraded across the last 40 years, especially by money in politics. But the notion that, for example, even if President Trump, if anyone wanted to create a dictatorship next year, the notion that the military and the FBI and the courts would support it and that the American people would tolerate it is just preposterous. And so this kind of fear-mongering, which I think both sides engage in, it's first of all, it just further deepens the mistrust of the American people in the political system. It fosters a sense of hopelessness. I hadn't thought of the important point you raised that comparing Trump to Hitler might encourage someone to try to harm him. I think that's an excellent point and very troubling. All of these things. But this kind of, that said, to be fair to President Biden, President Trump has said he wants to be a dictator. He has said that he'd like to lock up his opponents who are vermin, says that immigrants poison our blood. So these comparisons to Hitler don't completely out of thin air. And it is understandable that reasonable Americans fear President Trump's intentions. But I would say that the main thing is that, and this is something that people in Washington forget because they have gotten used to seeing the American people as children and underestimating the American people and underestimating the intelligence of the American people and our commitment to our freedom, that you could put Hitler or Stalin in the Oval Office next year, and even they could not come close to creating a dictatorship in this country, in our country. If we continue another 20 to 30 years down the road we're on, with the American people feeling increasingly disenfranchised and angry and alienated from the system, well, then if you ask me 20 years from now, I might give you a different answer. But right now, this hysterical fear-mongering does not help anyone.
Professor, that comment that you mentioned that Donald Trump said he wanted to be a dictator, it was a one-off comment that he made where he said, I'd be dictator for a day. He was really talking about, what all presidents over the last few presidencies, really starting with Obama, have done, where on the first day they issue a lot of executive orders. And that's really what he was talking about. And, Trump doesn't watch his mouth as much as most politicians do, because frankly, he's not really a politician. And that's where he gets himself in trouble. But, from a policy perspective, he seems to be the one who's fighting for more openness and more freedom and less government control over things. So it'll be a kind of strange way to try to be a fascist dictator.
Well, I'm certainly not making an argument that is his intention. I'm not. I take no sides. I literally neither in public nor in private, because my position is that both parties have been hopelessly damaged by money in politics, that both parties have to be fundamentally changed. I think that a huge part of President Trump's appeal is precisely that he doesn't filter himself, that he speaks what's on his mind. Whether what he says, a lot of what he says is not too attractive and can be scary, but I think that people at least perceive him as authentic, that with him, what you see is what you get. And to a nation that is sick of a political life and a political conversation that is empty, that consists of slogans rather than substance, where the public face of our politics has become so inauthentic that people compare it to Japanese kabuki theater. People perceive President Trump as a change agent, as someone who is challenging the system, as a disruptor. When I talk to Republicans, because I talk to Americans of all political stripes all the time in my work, the phrase I always hear is, he's going to shake things up. Now, President Trump hasn't shown us a plan really for changing the system and really putting the American people back in charge. But nonetheless, he is able to position himself as an outsider running against the system. That's why he won in 2016. I think that's also why he's going to win this time. I don't endorse that outcome, nor do I condemn it, but that's the way it's shaping out.
Yeah, and to your point about money in politics, I think one of the reasons that the establishment fears him so much is that he's not beholden to what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And although, of course, there's a lot of money in the Republican Party, Donald Trump being that outsider, and this is something that I think a lot of populists on the left and on the right can agree with. In the final minute and a half we have left, could you tell us a bit about Save Democracy in America, this organization that you're the founder of?
Thank you so much for asking. So our sole purpose, we're a nonpartisan campaign to achieve the public financing of federal elections using the voter dollars system. It's also been called democracy vouchers. And the principle is simply, since the only people who really have much influence in Washington anymore are heavy campaign donors, we will make ourselves the donors. The government would give every registered voter an online account of campaign cash. You can't take it out and spend it, but you go online and assign it to the candidates you want to support. And we fund the system at the robust levels that we are demanding. Candidates who want to serve us can get enough money from the voters to run a competitive campaign, and their opponents no longer have an excuse for taking money from special interests or billionaires. And that's we are nonpartisan, and I'm getting support from both sides of the aisle, because no matter how much we disagree about guns, abortion, or Donald Trump, none of us are okay with our government being for sale, because that is betrayal of the values that made our country great, that make us Americans, that what our country stands for. And more, I am seeing that this is getting money out of politics is a unifying issue that can bring us together and dial back the anger. Not a kumbaya moment. We have our disagreements, and we should have our disagreements, but we don't have to be so angry about it. And this is a way to be less angry and remind ourselves we're all Americans. We're all in this together.
All right, Professor, just in just a few seconds, where can people go? What's the website to go to look at, to find out about this more, and to follow your work?
Thank you. It's savedemocracyinamerica.org, savedemocracyinamerica.org. You can also Google Dan McMillan, Money in Politics. Please share it with your friends, because among people you know personally who trust you, our message is 100 times more powerful coming from you than it can ever be coming from me. So don't think you can't move the ball down the field. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Dan McMillan. Thank you for joining Eyes on Israel. We'll be right back in a few moments. So we're at war, and I just want to throw a question out to you to think about. Right after Thanksgiving, every year in New York City, after Thanksgiving, to kick off the Christmas shopping season, there is a Christmas tree lighting at Rockefeller Plaza. Everyone aware of that, right? Big event, people bring their families, and they have this massive Christmas tree, and that's the kickoff to the Christmas shopping season. And this year, at the Christmas tree lighting in Rockefeller Plaza, there was a violent demonstration by pro-Hamas, anti-Israel activists who were screaming, they were chanting, "Christmas is canceled," and then the other regular anti-Israel genocidal slogans like "from the river to the sea," etc. This wasn't an isolated incident. In London, during the Christmas shopping season this year, there were similar violent demonstrations of pro-Hamas, anti-Israel activists disrupting the Christmas shopping in Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Street in the main shopping district in London. Also screaming similar slogans about Christmas being canceled, and then the usual pro-Hamas, anti-Israel slogans. And in Italy, in Rome, every year there's a big opera house called the La Scala Opera, which every year has an annual Christmas pageant, a Christmas performance. And at the La Scala Opera this year, the Christmas performance was interrupted by anti-Israel, pro-Hamas demonstrators who came into the opera hall, went up on stage, and disrupted the Christmas performance. And a few weeks ago, on Easter Sunday, at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, the Easter Mass was interrupted by pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrators. Now, why am I mentioning all this? Because I'm going to state the obvious. Jews don't celebrate Christmas or Easter. We're not Christian. Israel has a 2% Christian minority, but Israel's a Jewish state. Why does it make sense to our enemies to demonstrate against Israel by disrupting Christmas and Easter? It's not stupid. You see, I understand. Yeah, it's stupid. It's kind of like the Queers for Palestine thing, right? Like, don't they know that if they were there, they'd be like, right? Whenever we laugh at our enemies and think that they're fools, we miss what's really going on. Because we stop thinking about it, we just go, oh, they're idiots. I'm asking a serious question. And try to answer it for yourself. Why does it make sense to them? Because it obviously makes perfect sense to them. In their minds, it makes perfect sense to demonstrate against Christmas because of their hatred for the state of Israel, which is not a Christian country. Think about that question. In the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, a time for love, a time for hate, right? That's up there. A time to build, a time to destroy. For everything there is a season. It's one of the most well-known passages in the Bible. It almost sounds like a nursery rhyme. And the last line of it says, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. It sounds pretty simple. Time for war, time for peace. Folks, this verse, it looks simple, but it's actually a very, very challenging verse. Let me explain. This verse was not written to two different people. It was written to each and every one of us. And the point of the verse is to say that you need to know what time it is. Because if it is a time for war, and you think it's a time for peace, and you treat it like a time for peace, you are going to make grave mistakes. Now, the same is true in the reverse. If it's a time for peace, and you think it's a time for war, and we all know people like that, You'll also make mistakes, but the point is you need to know what time it is. Now, we like a time for peace, right? We're people of faith, and we like peace, and we want to work towards peace, and peace is comfortable, and it's nice, and we want it to be a time for peace. We want to act that way. And we don't get to choose when it changes from a time for peace to a time for war. Our enemies have a say in that. But when that shift happens, we better make that pivot. And if we don't make that pivot, we're going to be looking through the wrong lens. We're going to see things in a warped way because it's a time for war and we're still thinking it's a time for peace. Now, do you understand what I mean? That this is a very challenging verse? It's not an easy pivot to make. It's a pivot we resist. We want it to be a time for peace. We like that. And if we insist on staying there and it's a time for war, God help us. And I'm not only talking about what's going on in Israel, on our borders with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. I'm also talking about what's going on in this country, what's going on worldwide. As Israel fights its war against Hamas, we have to ask ourselves, when there is a war between the nation of Israel and its enemies in the land of Israel, what does the Bible tell us about how to pray about war? As people of faith, we like to think more about peace. We like to work towards peace. We like to work towards reconciliation. But there are times, and we don't choose them, our enemies do. There are times when we must turn our attention towards war. And the Bible tells us how to think about it and what it means. Near the beginning of the war in Israel, I attended the funeral of the son of dear friends of mine, Yosef Malachi Gedalia. He was a commando in an elite unit in the Israeli army. He was killed on the battlefield on October 7th, defending the southern communities of Israel. And at that funeral, as with the funeral of every fallen soldier, Psalm 83 was read. Now, Psalm 83 is not a psalm that you would associate with funerals. It's not a mournful psalm. It doesn't really speak about death, but it's a psalm about the meaning of war. So let's take a look at Psalm 83 and learn from it how to think about war and how to pray about war. Psalm 83 begins by calling out to God not to be silent and to speak up on behalf of God's people. In verse 2 we read, "For behold, your enemies are in an uproar, and those who hate you raise their heads." Your enemies and those who hate you. The enemies of God are the enemies of Israel. Your enemies. Now, why do we call the enemies of Israel the enemies of God? That might seem like a very arrogant thing to say, but think about it. Throughout the Bible, the most repeated prophecy in the Bible is that after a lengthy exile, the nation of Israel will return to our land and reconstitute ourselves as a people. As Moses first laid out in the book of Deuteronomy, even if you are scattered to the ends of the heavens, from there the Lord your God will bring you back, and you will take possession of the land and become more numerous and more prosperous. This prophecy was God's way of telling the world that he directs history. So when the nation of Israel comes back to the land of Israel, that is God showing the world that he is in charge. So those who rise up against the nation of Israel, those who rise up against us to prevent us from taking possession of the land, are the enemies of God's word. But later on in the psalm, it speaks about the nations of the world who oppose Israel, trying to destroy the people of Israel. We read 2 verses later, they say, "Come, let us cut them off from nationhood, so Israel's name will not be remembered any longer." Think about all those protesters, those anti-Israel protesters who want to destroy the nation of Israel from the river to the sea. They don't just want to win this war. They want, as the psalm says, to cut them off from nationhood. And then later in the psalm, in the middle of it, we read a list of nations who oppose the nation of Israel. And most of them are nations that don't exist anymore. Edom, Ishmaelites, Moab, Hagrites, Gabal, Ammon, Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. I want to draw your attention to that last phrase, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. In this list of nations, all of them are joined by the word and, Moab and the Hagrites, Edom and the Ishmaelites, except for 2 nations, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Somehow the psalmist is telling us, the word of God is telling us that there's some closer connection, some closer bond of partnership between Philistia and the inhabitants of Tyre. Philistia, for those who may not know, is today what we know as the Gaza Strip. That's the land of the Philistines. That's Philistia. The inhabitants of Tyre is southern Lebanon. So here in the Bible, we see this special bond among the enemies of Israel between those who are attacking us in the Gaza Strip and in southern Lebanon. And then we pray to God to defeat our enemies, to help us in defeating them. And then towards the end of the psalm, I'm jumping to the end now, we read, "Pursue them with your tempest, terrify them with your storm, fill their faces with shame, so they will seek your name, O Lord. Let them be shamed and terrified forever." Now, why are we asking God to make our enemies feel shame? Why is that important to us? Isn't it just enough for us to defeat our enemies so they leave us alone? Why do we care if our enemies are also ashamed? But there's actually a very deep lesson here. You see, shame is a very important emotion. If I'm ashamed of something I did, it means that I know that what I did is evil. I know that what I did is sinful. I know that what I did is wrong, and therefore I feel ashamed. If I don't think I did anything wrong, I feel no shame. So the reason that we pray for our enemies to feel shame is that we want our enemies to understand that what they did was wrong. In other words, we're praying for them to have a change of heart. We're praying for them to realize the error of their ways. And that's why, as we read again, "Fill their faces with shame, then they will seek your name, O Lord." And the psalm ends by praying to the Lord that our enemies will know that you, whose name is the Lord, are alone most high over all the earth. That's how this psalm concludes. We don't want victory because we want victory. We want victory so that our enemies will know the truth and that the kingdom of God will reign over all the earth. So as we sit here and watch the news every day and we're praying for Israel and we're concerned about the future and we get caught up in the headlines and the politics of the moment, let's remember that right here in the Bible, written thousands of years ago, there's a description of this war, of the enemies of God, the enemies of Israel, working to destroy the nationhood of Israel. We read about the nations who have bonded together, Philistia and Tyre, Lebanon and the Gaza Strip, and we pray to God to bring us victory, not for our sake, so that the kingdom of God will reign over all the earth, and we could fulfill the words of the prophets who pray for the day where knowledge of God will fill the earth like water covers the sea.